So let's start from the very beginning. First of all, structure and energy are separate elements in Freud's psychoanalytical theory. We can easily understand this idea by comparing it to a steam engine, by imagining the mind as the physical structure and the energy as the amount of steam needed to propel the engine. Therefore, if we suppose that this circle is the structure of the psychic apparatus or the engine, there will also be another constitutive element that is a quantity of psychic energy called Q that circulates in this apparatus and that can be compared to steam in an engine. Freud was always a dualist. That is to say, he always supposed the presence of two different types of energies in the psychic apparatus, except for a brief period when he hypothesized the presence of only one type of energy that he called libido or sexual drive. Initially, he thought that libido and ego energy were the two different types of mental steam. They can be represented in the psychic apparatus using different colors. Libido has the purpose of preserving the species, and the ego instincts are meant to preserve the individual through self-preservational behaviors, such as breathing, finding sustenance, etc. However, Freud never gave great importance to the ego's instincts. He later included self-preservation as one of the purposes of the sexual energy, meaning in a certain sense that we look to preserve ourselves because we love ourselves. At that moment, he could have become a monist, hypothesizing only one type of energy, the libido, in the psychic apparatus. However, from the 1920s onwards, he replaced the ego's instincts with a more philosophical concept, which he gave the name of death drive. So, his last dualist theory was based on the juxtaposition of libido and death drive, also called eros and thanatos. So where does the libido or sexual drive come from? Freud spoke of Trieb, a German word that was translated into English as instinct or drive. In addition, he introduced the idea of an erogenous zone, which he termed as any region of the skin or the mucous membrane that is susceptible to sexual arousal. These specific regions of the body are functionally the seat of such excitement. The oral, anal, urethro-genital, and nipples are areas that are privileged erogenous zones. The erogenous zones are the sources from which the libido originates or flows. He described 4 characteristics of the libido: a source, a pressure, an aim, and an object. The source of a drive is a specific region of the body where the excitation appears. The erogenous zone, an organ, or an apparatus. Or the somatic process that is produced in that part of the body and that is perceived as excitement. The object is that by which a drive seeks to reach its aim, that is, its satisfaction. The object is determined by the history, mainly the childhood history, of each individual. And unlike the instinct, is not constitutionally determined. The pressure is the variable quantitative factor that affects each drive and that explains the action triggered to obtain satisfaction. It is the economic aspect of the drive and the amount of work demanded that it imposes on the psychic apparatus. Again, this concept can be illustrated by using the steam engine as an example, in that the greater amount of steam that has built up creates a higher pressure, which in turn forces the engine to run. As we can see, when we try to describe what the libido is, we find ourselves describing a somatic type of energy. One of Freud's definitions of drive is actually a limit concept on the border of the psychic and the somatic. Another basic idea in Freud's psychoanalytical theory is that the human mind is not a whole, but divided into parts. Freud compared the human mind to a crystal and said that mentally insane patients' minds are like broken crystals, shattered after they have been thrown to the floor. However, healthy people also have these lines of cleavage, these invisible boundaries that for now we can schematically represent here. A first line of cleavage is between our conscious and our unconscious. That is to say, what we are aware of and what we are not aware of. Now, there are different ways of not being aware of mental contents. Some mental contents never reach our consciousness, whereas others reached our consciousness and were rejected, and others are simply not focused by our consciousness, but can easily become conscious. In order to understand these differences, we have to modify our picture in this way. This is basically what Freud called first topography. Freud's efforts in psychoanalysis led him to the formulation of two fundamentally different models of the psychic apparatus, which he called first and second topography. The first topography can be divided into three parts: a conscious, preconscious, and an unconscious. When describing the functioning of these psychic systems in Freudian psychoanalytical theory, it is important to keep in mind what Freud called metapsychology, i.e., an approach that takes dynamic, topographical, and economic aspects of psychological phenomena. According to his first theory, the unconscious was generated by repression, which means that certain impulses and mental content, because they were dynamically resisted by the preconscious system, were denied the possibility of becoming conscious. At the time of the formulation of the first topography, the unconscious and the repressed were basically the same thing. At the same time, the preconscious system contained all the psychic materials which can eventually become conscious once the consciousness focuses on them. Later, however, Freud did not speak much about these three systems, the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious, but rather about two structures, the ego and the superego, that constitute the psychic apparatus in addition to the id. This is his second topography, also called the structural model. The first and the second formulations, or first and second topography, do not coincide. The ego in the structural model is not the same as the conscious, preconscious systems of the first topography, and the id is not the same as the unconscious system. First of all, parts of the ego, such as the superego, the ego, defenses, and character structure, which will be discussed later, are unconscious. Moreover, parts of the id are unconscious but not repressed. This small area here is our perception consciousness, namely an organ appointed for the perception of the stimuli that come from our inner world, our thoughts or feelings, and those that we perceive from our outer world. Perception consciousness is only a very small part compared to the rest of the mind. It is just a part of our ego which, as we can see, includes conscious, preconscious, and unconscious parts. The preconscious part of the ego contains those mental contents that we can become aware of when we focus our attention on them. On the contrary, the id, which is completely unconscious, contains both mental contents that we are not aware of because the ego rejected them. This area here that says repressed, and mental contents that were always unconscious. Why does the ego reject some mental contents and accept others? This question about how these lines of cleavage, namely the id, the ego, and the superego originated, will be answered in the following videos.